On a dreary afternoon, the clouds hung low in the sky, casting a gloomy shadow over the neighborhood. The gray sky looked heavy, like a thick blanket ready to smother everything below. A cold wind rustled through the trees, creating an eerie sound that seemed to whisper secrets only the branches understood. The trees twisted and turned in the wind, their bare branches resembling skeletal fingers reaching for something just out of reach. The atmosphere was unnerving, like the calm before a storm, and it sent a shiver down Mark's spine. 12-year-old Mark was out on his usual route after school, his mind racing with thoughts of homework and the video game he couldn't wait to play. But today felt different, as if something unseen was lurking around the corner. Just as he approached his front yard, he noticed the mailbox standing tall, waiting for him. His heart quickened with a sudden rush of curiosity. He loved the thrill of discovering a new postcard or a surprise letter from a friend. With a swift motion, he opened the mailbox, his heart pounding in anticipation. Inside, however, he found something unusual that made his blood run cold. A single glass eye, cold and lifeless, rested at the bottom of the mailbox. It was not the kind of surprise he had hoped for. The eye was grotesquely unsettling, glimmering with an ominous sheen that caught the dim light trying to seep through the clouds. Confusion and dread flooded his mind like an overwhelming wave. Why would someone send me a glass eye? He thought, his brows furrowing in deepest confusion. It seemed like a terrible prank, but there was no note, no indication of who it belonged to or why it was there. He quickly glanced around, scanning the empty street for any sign of a prankster hiding behind a bush or a tree. But the street lay silent, and there was no one in sight. Whoever left it was likely long gone. In a moment of reluctance, he picked it up gingerly, his fingers brushing against the smooth surface. A shiver traveled up his spine as he felt the weight of the glass eye in his palm. It felt heavier than he had expected, as if it bore the weight of untold secrets and stories waiting to be uncovered. A chill crept into his bones, but the thrill of mystery overshadowed his apprehension. He couldn't help but wonder what strange stories he could share with his friends at school. Little did he know, by bringing it home, he had unwittingly invited something far more sinister into his cozy space filled with posters and toys. As he placed the glass eye on his desk, its presence seemed to grow larger, filling the room with a strange, cloying silence. For a brief moment, everything felt still, as if the world outside had paused to witness his discovery. Then, Mark felt a strange sensation ripple through the air, as if the eye was watching him. A chill cascaded through his body, and he shook his head, trying to dismiss the unsettling thought. "It's just a piece of glass," he muttered, determined to shake off the unease creeping in. But the moment he turned to get ready for bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that the eye was somehow alive, lurking in the shadows of his room, waiting patiently. That night, he tried to sleep, but the feeling of being watched gnawed at him. It was as if invisible eyes were fixed on him, penetrating and unwavering. He tossed and turned, hiding under the covers as if they could protect him from whatever malevolent force the eye might possess. Whenever he shut his eyes, he imagined the eye opening, staring back at him with an unblinking gaze that sent waves of fear down his spine. Mark wanted desperately to believe he was just being silly, but deep down, something told him he might not be completely wrong. Finally, exhaustion swept over him, and he drifted into a restless sleep. His dreams were invaded by nightmares, filled with shadows that danced around him like mischievous spirits whispering his name. In these dreams, the glass eye loomed larger than life, following him wherever he went. He could hear disembodied whispers echoing in the night, making the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. When he woke the next morning, the first thing he felt was an overwhelming urgency to push the glass eye out of his mind. He resolved to ignore the eye altogether, telling himself that a normal boy in a normal neighborhood shouldn't fear an inanimate object. Instead, he decided to take it back to the mailbox and let it go. Surely, it would be better off with whoever had left it there in the first place. However, when he returned to his room later that day, his heart sank as he found the glass eye had seemingly shifted positions on the desk. Mark's stomach knotted with panic, and he questioned his own sanity. "I must have moved it," he told himself, trying to decipher how it could have ended up facing the wall. Yet, the dread washed over him again, heavier than before. The eye's color seemed almost vivid, as if it was trying to communicate some hidden truth that sent chills down his spine. Whatever marked the transformation, it felt real, and he couldn't shake the dreadful feeling that something was following him. His school day passed in a haze of thoughts about the eye. Teachers droned on, but Mark could hardly focus on classes filled with numbers and words. Both math and history faded into a wall of noise as the eye loomed larger in his memory with each tick of the clock. A sense of unease wrapped around him like a tight cloak, making each passing moment feel longer and more tortuous. Every creak of the floorboards in his classroom, every gust of wind outside, felt like a whisper, a warning from the other side, echoing in his ears. Mark craved someone to confide in, a friend or even a teacher who might help him understand the peculiar situation he found himself in. But fear held him back, gripping his tongue, making him doubt that anyone would believe him. Instead, he kept the glass eye a secret, burying his worries beneath the day-to-day life of a sixth grader, filled with assignments and soccer practice. After school, as he walked home, Mark couldn't shake the eerie vibe that swallowed him whole. The shadows around him seemed to darken, and he turned quickly to scan the empty streets behind him. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a flicker of movement darting between the trees. But it was only the branches swaying in the cold wind, rattling like skeletal fingers. Still, his heart raced, and a thin layer of sweat formed on his brow as he reached for the front door. Once inside, the feeling of safety was short-lived. As he entered his room, his heart sunk further, for the glass eye sat on the desk, unmistakably facing him once again. Once more, he was certain it had changed positions while he was gone. Panic gripped him tightly like a vice. He walked closer, feeling as if the room itself was holding its breath. The more he stared at it, the more alive it seemed, almost as if it were daring him to come closer, to touch it again. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, he said, "If you're just a piece of glass, you can't hurt me." Cringing inwardly at his own words, he felt foolish talking to an object. Yet, he had to steel his nerves. He stepped forward, reaching out a trembling hand to touch the eye. The moment his fingers brushed against the cool surface, a deep sensation flooded through him. Images flooded his mind. Flashes of moments captured through hidden eyes. Suddenly, he stumbled back, his heart racing in terror. He shook his head, desperate to erase the vision. Sweat dripped down his brow, pooling at the base of his neck. The world around him felt too quiet, so he quickly rushed to the window, hoping for a breath of fresh air to cool his mind. Outside, the wind howled, and the dark clouds brought a wicked promise of rain. It felt as if the sky was mirroring his inner turmoil. Mark tried to focus on the routine things in life: homework, chores, meals. But nothing seemed to distract him from the haunting presence of that glass eye. It felt as though it was weaving itself into the very fabric of his life, and he helplessly wondered if it would ever let him go. Little did he know that the glass eye was only the beginning. And soon, it would draw him into a world he had never imagined, filled with wonders and terrors waiting to be uncovered. The days turned into a strange mix of reality and worry for Mark. It was as if he were living in a dream where everything felt both real and unreal at the same time. No matter where he wandered in his house, the weight of the glass eye seemed to follow him, pulling at his thoughts like a heavy backpack strapped to his shoulders. It became harder and harder to pretend that everything was just fine. The other kids at school were engrossed in their new video games and excited weekend plans. They wouldn't understand even if he tried to tell them the truth. One evening, after the smell of warm spaghetti and meatballs filled their little kitchen, Mark chose to study for an upcoming math test in his room. Sitting at his desk, surrounded by his neatly stacked schoolbooks, he made an earnest effort to focus, trying to wrap his mind around the tricky equations that danced on the pages before him. But every time he stole a glance at the glass eye perched atop his shelf, it seemed to shift ever so slightly, almost like it was taunting him. An unsettling chill would rip through him, making his skin prickle. It was as if the eye held a sense of hunger, its cloudy surface swirling with a darkness that made him shiver. Mark struggled to concentrate on his studies, but the creepy feeling crept back in at every opportunity. As the days crawled by, the glass eye became a constant presence, an uninvited guest in Mark's life. It was a somber reminder of something dark and unknown lurking just beyond his understanding. He felt a strange thread connecting him to the eye, binding him to it in a way that sent chills down his spine. What did it want from him? The haunting notion that it craved something made him feel uneasy, gnawing at the edges of his mind. It was no longer just an odd trinket. It had transformed into something sinister, an entity that weaved itself through his thoughts and invaded his dreams. One particularly restless night, when the world outside was wrapped in deep shadows, Mark woke to an unsettling low rumbling sound emanating from the corner of his room. His heart raced, pounding against his chest as if a wild animal were trying to escape. In the dim light of his night lamp, he glanced over at the glass eye, which glimmered ominously. To his shocked disbelief, it seemed to pulse, almost vibrating with an energy he had never noticed before, making dread pool heavy in his stomach. The sound was rhythmic, like a low, eerie breathing, as if the eye itself were alive, aware, and watching him. Mark forced himself to sit up, trembling as he peered into the dark corner of his room. "It's just my imagination," he whispered, trying to reassure himself, but his voice quivered, betraying his fear. Mustering what little courage he could find, he reached for the light switch. As the room flooded with brightness, things looked ordinary again. His desk was neatly arranged, his bed was still made. But the unsettling feeling that something was wrong gnawed at his sanity like a hungry dog. The very next day, as he took the familiar path home from school, Mark could not shake off the weirdness surrounding him. Birds cawed strangely, and he could have sworn he saw shadows dancing just out of sight. People who used to smile and greet him now mumbled in hushed voices, their faces grim. The warm comfort of home, which had once been a cozy haven, now felt like a distant dream. It was as if a dark cloud had settled over him, casting a shadow on everything he loved. His friends, once loud and cheerful, now felt distant, like echoes of laughter from a world he no longer belonged to. Mark felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of his own life, invisible to everyone around him, overshadowed by the oppressive weight of the eye. Feeling lost, Mark confided in his mother about his fears. He watched as a flicker of concern crossed her face like a fleeting shadow, but it quickly vanished, replaced by her usual warm smile and reassuring tone. "It's just your imagination, sweetie. You're probably just tired from school," she said, brushing off his worries like they were mere dust on the table. But her words felt empty, landing on his heart like stones, and he retreated into the solitude of his room, feeling lonelier than ever. The eye stared down at him, and in that moment, it felt as if it was mocking him, thriving off the fear that bubbled within him. As the weeks passed, Mark's world began to shift in unsettling ways. His dreams turned bizarre, blurring the lines between reality and nightmares. Whispered voices haunted him, growing louder and more persistent until they consumed his thoughts. They called his name, a demonic chant echoing through his mind, weaving a tapestry of dread over his conscience. Something in his life felt dangerously out of balance, and with each passing moment, the weight of the glass eye pressed deeper into his thoughts. How could he escape this terrifying nightmare? Little by little, Mark's hope began to fade. The walls of calm seemed to constrict around him, tightening like a snake coiling around its prey. Desperate for relief, he tried everything he could think of. He shoved the eye deep into the back of his closet, wrapping it in old rags and sweaters, hoping to hide its presence away. He even attempted to throw it away, marching to the trash can with all the resolve he could muster. But somehow, there it was again, always returning to its spot on his desk as though an invisible force was drawing it back, more powerful than his will. The eye refused to let go, tethered to him in a way that was both unsettling and confusing, as if it were tied to his very soul. Sleep deprivation slowly chipped away at his mind. It wrapped itself around him like a thick fog, making it nearly impossible for him to think straight. On those sleepless nights, he became convinced that the glass eye had developed the power to absorb his thoughts, siphoning off pieces of his very being until only a husk of who he used to be remained. Each day he woke more exhausted than the last, his dreams filled with dark, swirling shapes and sinister laughter that echoed long after he had opened his eyes. The vibrant world around him faded like an old photograph, losing its color and warmth, leaving everything dull and gray. With every passing moment, he felt himself drawn toward the glass eye, like a moth fluttering ever closer to a dangerous flame. The darker things became, the more Mark began to feel that the glass eye was not just watching him, it was judging him. Its empty gaze felt heavy, scrutinizing everything he did. Even mundane tasks like brushing his teeth or tying his shoelaces felt laced with a sense of dread. What did it want? Why was it so determined to stay in his life? Mark could not find answers to these questions, though they spun in his mind like a cyclone, leaving him dizzy and frightened. It didn't help when his dreams took on a new tone entirely. Images of the eye began to seep into his nighttime thoughts, turning into haunting visions of darkness and fear. In one dream, the eye grew larger and larger until it filled the entire sky. It cast a shadow over everything, snuffing out the sun and plunging the world into a cold, dark void. The air was filled with whispers that sounded like angry bees buzzing around his head. He could hear his own name repeated over and over again, a chilling chant that sent shivers racing down his spine. When he awoke, his heart raced as if he had just sprinted several miles. Each morning without relief felt like a small victory. He had survived another night. Yet, as days passed into weeks, Mark started to worry about his own sanity. His friends began to notice that something was wrong. They would call for him during lunch at school, but he felt miles away, as if a great divide had formed between their world of laughter and friendship and his own lonely prison of fear. Their voices pierced through the fog, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. It was as if he were stuck behind a glass wall, watching their lives go on while he remained trapped in his own torment. One day, after a particularly long night of restless dreaming, Mark found himself sitting alone at lunch. The cafeteria buzzed with voices. The smell of pizza wafted through the air like a siren song, pulling at his stomach. His friends were at a table nearby, their laughter echoing, but he felt completely out of place. The laughter sounded hollow, like it belonged to someone else in a different part of the world. He picked at his food, each bite feeling like a chore. It was then that Alex, his best friend, noticed him staring off into space. "Hey, Mark, are you okay?" Alex asked, his concern evident. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. "Yeah, I'm fine," he managed to say, but even to his own ears, that answer felt unconvincing and weak. Alex frowned, looking skeptical. "You don't look fine. You've been kind of weird lately. You know you can talk to me, right?" Mark forced a smile, thinking of how he could explain the heavy feeling in his chest, the eye that seemed to loom over him, watching, always watching. But how could he put that into words? "It's just, school has been hard," he replied, trying to deflect. "Just hard?" Alex's brow furrowed. "You used to love math." "Yeah, I just need to study more," Mark said. But even as he spoke, he felt the truth lodged inside like a thorn, pricking at his heart. No matter how hard he tried, the eye was enveloping his thoughts. It was twisting his mind in knots, whispering to him in the shadowy corners of the dark. Alex nodded, but the concern never left his face. "Okay, but if you want to talk, I'm here," he said before returning to his lunch. Mark picked at his food for a bit longer before eventually pushing it away. The bustling cafeteria felt like a distant planet, filled with an atmosphere he no longer belonged to. He watched as laughter bounced around him, warm and comforting like an embrace. But he remained in his bubble of silence, a barrier cast by fear and the weight of the glass eye that never left his thoughts. Days passed, each one like a grain of sand slipping through his fingers. The eye loomed larger in Mark's life, its presence relentless. It seemed to gnaw at him, feeding off the very essence of his spirit. Mark feared the inevitable. He couldn't escape its grip. He felt as though he were on the precipice of a vast and dark chasm, teetering dangerously close to falling in. How much longer could he bear this weight? Would he ever find a way to break free? In the creeping shadows of his room, Mark knew a choice awaited him, but the path was unclear. A creeping fear told him that he would have to confront the eye. Only then could he discover what it truly wanted from him. But would he find the courage to face it? He glanced at the eye once again, its surface glinting in the soft light. The time had come to delve into the mystery and pull back the curtain of fear. So, with a heart heavy with trepidation yet spurred on by a flicker of determination, Mark took a deep breath. The unveiling would begin, whether he was ready for it or not. Mark's grip on reality began to slip like water through his fingers, and in the depths of his despair, he discovered something peculiar. Alongside the terrible dread, he felt a strange sensation. The eye was feeding off his fears, his worries, every tiny ounce of his fragile state. It was as if the glass eye had become a malevolent puppeteer, skillfully tugging on the strings of his mind, cultivating a garden overflowing with shadows more grotesque than the glass eye itself. It seemed cruel and vicious, growing stronger as Mark's anxieties multiplied, creating an atmosphere thick with unease that covered him like a heavy blanket. The shadows danced at the corners of his vision, whispering secrets that only he could hear. They grew louder during the quiet moments, slithering into his thoughts and bringing him nothing but despair. The entire world felt like it was closing in around him, and he was trapped in a nightmare with no escape. One stormy night, as dark clouds rumbled like angry giants and rain poured down in sheets, Mark realized he could not hide any longer. The thunder roared angrily in the sky, and he felt a surge of determination bubbling up amidst the fear. He stood before the eye, trembling with a mix of fear and a desperate desire to reclaim control over his existence. "What do you want?" he whispered, his voice shaking like a leaf in the wind. His heart pounded loudly in his chest, a drum echoing his dread and bravery. As if in response, the glass eye pulsed with a low vibration, glowing ominously like a firefly in the night. With each pulse, a shiver ran down his spine, but he pressed forward, willing himself to stand strong in the face of this terrifying presence. The patterns of its glow seemed to shift, reflecting madness back at him, and at that moment, Mark realized how far he had fallen down the rabbit hole. Instead of facing some supernatural force, he was battling the dark recesses of his own mind. Horrifying thoughts surged forward, bombarding him like a storm. Perhaps the eye was not a separate entity at all, but a mirror to his own fears, a horrifying reflection of everything that tormented him. Despair was a wave crashing over him, dragging him down into a deep abyss. How could he ever escape it if it lived inside him, growing stronger with every flicker of fear? It felt as if there was no way out, no escape from the prison he had created within himself. Despite the terror surging inside him, Mark decided he would not surrender. He spent that night trying to purge the darkness that clung to him like a shadow. Desperate not to succumb to the malevolence the glass eye represented, he yelled and cried out, anger and frustration pouring from his heart like a broken dam. He stood as fiercely as he could in the face of it all, scaring away the shadows that flickered at the corners of his vision with his fiery spirit. He recited passages from his favorite stories, trying to drown out the whispers that clawed at his mind like a swarm of restless insects. The room morphed into a tempest of emotion, a theater of panic and uncertainty. But through it all, the glass eye remained, unyielding and immovable, an ever-watchful sentinel keeping him in its thorns. Days slipped into one another, and though Mark had emerged from that long night with renewed determination, it became clear that the siege was far from over. The shadows were still there, lurking, waiting to pull him back into their dark embrace. His resilience crumbled like old plaster, and he found himself turning inward, suffocating under the relentless gaze of the glass eye. Each passing interaction with the world outside felt surreal. His parents' voices were like echoes bouncing off distant walls, and his schoolmates' laughter rang like a mocking chorus, an unsettling reminder of how far away he had drifted from normality. Mark felt like a drifting soul, tethered only to the all-seeing glass eye that had ensnared him in a web of dread. On what felt like the last day of his sanity, Mark made a solemn vow against its malevolence. He gathered every ounce of courage he could muster and devised a plan. He would invite the eye into the open, confront it, and demand its release from his life. The thought of standing against it filled him with hope yet paralyzed him with fear. As he prepared to speak to the eye one last time, he could feel the shadows thickening around him like creeping vines, the atmosphere turning oppressively claustrophobic, filled with the weight of unseen eyes, perhaps even the souls that it had consumed before. "I refuse to let you control me any longer," he shouted, his voice intent and full of fierce determination. But the words fell flat against the glass's cold, unyielding surface. Silence swallowed the room, thick like fog, and the air vibrated with unholy energy, circling around him like a wild storm. As he finally grasped the eye between his palms, he felt a piercing jolt of pain shoot through him like a bolt of lightning. A voice, guttural and distorted, echoed all around him. "You cannot escape. You are mine." The eyes suddenly filled with a blinding light, brighter than 1,000 suns. Mark felt his thoughts whirl away like leaves picked up by a fierce wind, tossing him around in a storm of panic. It clawed at his insides, a ravenous beast ready to consume all that made him who he was. The walls of his room twisted and warped in a delirious blur, and he staggered back, feeling every inkling of hope slipping away into the deep shadows. A moment of clarity flickered in the chaos, but it was barely a glow in the night, the realization that there was no escape, no way to wrench control back from the eerie omnipresence that loomed over every corner of his existence. That restless night, Mark's world spiraled into an abyss of terror. The darkness that had begun as a gentle whisper now conspired against him, and the whispers crescendoed into a cacophony that drowned out any remnant of his spirit. The connections he once held dear, his friends, his family, his dreams, unraveled before his very eyes, replaced with glistening, alien eyes that sparkled like daggers in the dark. He wanted to scream, to release the anguish swelling inside him, but a numbing silence enveloped him like a heavy cloak as he fell into an unfathomable pit of despair. He was utterly alone, trapped with only the eye to accompany him. Each passing moment felt like an eternity, the weight of despair carving deeper into his soul with every tick of the clock. It was an everlasting night, a haunting reality casting shadows over the mind where he no longer knew who he was supposed to be. The glass eye had transformed into both the monster hiding in the dark and the mirror reflecting the grotesque and malformed self that resided within him. Days merged into one another like a watercolor painting being washed away, and Mark lost all sense of time. His parents, who once filled the house with warmth and laughter, stopped coming in to check on him. Their worried voices faded into a distant memory. His friends, once a lively presence, had long forgotten him, leaving only whispers of joy that echoed in a land far removed from his current reality. The glass eye sat in its sinister stillness on his desk, always watching and waiting, it seemed, mocking him in a way that chilled him to his bones. Every flicker of its color took on an unsettling tone, reinforcing the crushing feeling of doom that wrapped around him like an unyielding chain. And then, in that deeply profound darkness, once bright with promise and dreams, Mark realized he had lost everything, his happiness, his hope, and ultimately, the very essence of who he was. The remnants of a child filled with stars and laughter had been extinguished, leaving only a hollow shell, trapped in a prison of silence and shadows. The moment he began to understand that the eye was an extension of his torment, a cruel fragment of his fears and insecurities, he surrendered completely, tipping over the edge into a void of despair that seemed endless. Mark sat quietly in his room, feeling the weight of sorrow becoming heavier, pressing down upon him like a lead blanket. He thought of the time before, the time spent playing with his friends, laughing, and dreaming of far-off places filled with adventures. But those memories felt like stories from another life, slipping further away as he sank into a dark abyss where the glass eye reigned supreme. Each moment became tangled in a web of sorrow and sadness, creating a thick fog that blotted out any light that dared to approach. But one night, amidst his internal struggle, a flicker of determination sparked within him once again. Mark couldn't bear the thought of giving in completely. He would not let the glass eye defeat him. He took a deep breath, feeling the air fill his lungs, and said to himself, "I am more than my fears, and I will not lose myself to you." It was a small whisper against the powerful tide of despair, but it ignited a flicker of hope, a tiny spark that dared to resist the darkness. And so, he began to organize his thoughts, to think of all the things he held dear. His favorite books, the magical places they took him, and the soaring adventures he yearned to embark upon. With each passing day, he recited those passages, stuck to them like a lifeline. Each word became a refuge where joy could be reclaimed, reminding him that the world was not just shadows and torment, but a tapestry of possibilities. As he persisted in his battle against the darkness, he felt strength returning to his heart. Step by step, through fear and determination, he began to unravel the chains the glass eye had wrapped around him. He learned to fight back, not only by yelling or crying but by believing in a brighter tomorrow. Mark would not let despair have the final say. Instead, he chose to write his own story, one filled with bravery, friendship, and hope. With every passing moment, the eye seemed just a bit dimmer. The shadows that once threatened to consume him started to recede, like clouds parting to reveal the sun. It became a battle of wills, and Mark knew he was not alone. Though the journey to reclaim himself was long and arduous, he had resolved to take it one step at a time. The true adventure had just begun. One cold and silent night, the weight of despair pressed so heavily upon Mark that it felt almost suffocating. He sat in his room, surrounded by the familiarity of his toys and books, but tonight they brought him no comfort. The glass eye glimmered menacingly on his desk under the pale light filtering through the shadows, a haunting reminder of everything he had sacrificed. Its gaze bore into him, cold and unyielding, stirring a deep fear within him, a fear that felt like a wave crashing against the shore of his fragile mind. Mark felt different. No longer did he feel like a mere boy, he felt like something much less. He was nothing more than a vessel, a puppet for the malevolence that surrounded him. Each night, he could feel the sinister whispers creeping closer, swirling around him like toxic smoke, invading his thoughts and filling his lungs with a putrid air. The eye had become a prison, a cage that tightened its grip each day, draining the very essence of who he was, leaving behind an empty shell. In that dark room, Mark could feel it now, a claustrophobic sensation inching closer, wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. The shadows loomed in on him, growing bolder, ready to steal away the last remnants of his sanity. He could sense the corners of his room softening and blurring, as dark shapes flitted about like phantoms. The night was silent except for the relentless rhythm of his own heartbeat, thumping loudly in his chest as if urging him to take action. He had to end this once and for all. Something inside him snapped, igniting a fiery resolve as his fingers curled tightly around the glass eye. It felt both warm and cold, pulsating as if alive, a strange and terrible heartbeat that intertwined with his own. "I'll set us both free," Mark yelled defiantly, his voice echoing in the empty room, bouncing off the walls. Though a part of him knew he was screaming into an empty void, the words were a vow, a promise to himself. With trembling hands, Mark hefted the eye, feeling its weight shift beneath him, and he lifted it high above his head. The world around him felt like it was shaking, trembling under the force of his emotions and fears. The whispers screamed back at him, a cacophony of joy and misery mingling, threading through his thoughts, threatening to drag him deeper into darkness. Without a moment's hesitation, he hurled the glass eye against the wall with all his might. It shattered into a million pieces, the sound ringing in his ears like a deadly chime. Each shard sparkled ominously in the dim light of his room, glistening like stars in a black sky. For a fleeting moment, Mark felt free. The whispers momentarily faded away, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to echo the sound of his heartbeat. He could breathe once more. But the moment was as fleeting as a shadow. The shattered pieces began to rearrange themselves, twisting together like grotesque tendrils of darkness. To his horror, they reformed back into the eye, stronger than before, brimming with an unsettling energy that seeped into the very walls of his room. A shiver ran down his spine, and the air thickened, growing heavier around him, wrapping him in a cloak of dread. The shadows twisted and writhed, taking on forms that were too monstrous to comprehend, their jagged edges gnashing with fury, hungry for his fear. A deep, guttural voice reverberated from the eye, booming louder and more powerful than it had before, announcing, "You cannot escape me." The intensity of the presence gripped him tighter than ever. It dragged him deeper into a swirling abyss of despair. Mark's heart raced. He realized that the eye was not just a physical object, it was an embodiment of all his fears, his guilt, his pain, and everything he had tried so desperately to suppress. It thrived on his torment, nurturing a cycle of dread that feasted on his very soul. The haunting realization hit him like a lightning bolt, sharper than the fragments of glass that had scattered across the floor. The eye pulsed with life, like a dark heart made from shadows, tugging at him, pulling him further into its grasp. The shadows began to dance wildly, their movements becoming erratic and chaotic, drawing him into their sinister embrace. Mark felt trapped, ensnared within a tempest of darkness, unable to breathe, as fear clawed at him like jagged nails. With every heartbeat, he felt himself slipping away, suffocated by the weight of everything he had lost, the weight of his desperation, pressing him down like an anchor dragging him into the depths of a dark, endless sea. Tears streamed down his cheeks, each drop a testament to his shattered spirit. Kneeling on the floor, he cried out, "Please, let me go," even though he knew there would be no kind response. The shadows laughed, a chilling chorus of despair that filled the air and reverberated within him. They had always been a part of him, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when he might be weak enough to claim their due. It seemed the eye had already done its work, dwindling Mark down to nothing until he was devoid of light. As he lay trembling on the floor, the shadows embraced him, whispering his name softly, wrapping their cold arms tightly around his mind. "Mark, Mark, join us," they called, their voices like a haunting lullaby. In that agonizing moment, Mark understood, there was no escape. The eye would always be a part of him, a grotesque reminder of the dread that had stifled him, a mirror of his own darkness reflecting back at him. He felt more like a ghost than he ever had, hollowed and twisted. Each breath turned into a gasp for something that had already vanished, like chasing after smoke. Mark surrendered to the shadows, allowing their clutches to engulf him entirely. He was drawn into a swirling vortex of despair, the air thickening with malevolence, the remnants of his spirit beginning to fade into oblivion. As he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of his life, the laughter of his friends, the warmth of his mother's hugs, the simple joys of a sunny afternoon. But amidst the brightness, darker memories surged, moments of fear, heartache, and loneliness. They twisted together in a chaotic dance, pulling him deeper into the void. With a final, blood-curdling scream, the boy slipped from reality, a mere echo of what had once been. In that moment, the glass eye on the desk gleamed in the darkness, unbroken, watching, waiting for the next soul to ensnare. It was ready to begin its twisted game anew, its surface shimmering with a promise that this was not the end but merely a pause in its endless cycle of darkness. Time stood still in Mark's room, where shadows crept and danced under the weight of silent commitments. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful cry that sang of lost hopes and despair. The world moved on, oblivious to the shattered pieces of a boy's spirit lying on the floor, the remnants of his struggle echoing in the stillness. But hope is a tricky thing. It can flicker weakly in the darkest of times, waiting for a chance to reignite. As the moon cast its pale light into the room, shining through the window like a lonely guardian, a faint shimmer caught a nearby shard of glass. It glowed gently, as if saying, "You are never truly alone." Somewhere, deep inside that grasp of shadows, a part of Mark still fought against the tide that wished to consume him entirely. It whispered of dreams and friendship, of bright days of laughter and love, and a desire to reclaim what was rightfully his. The battle within him raged on. The darkness may have consumed a part, but the light flickered ever so slightly, the promise of hope waiting for the right moment to rise. Tonight was colder than ever, and the shadows were restless, but perhaps, before the morning light broke, Mark's spirit would find a way through. A flicker of connection, a spark of resilience. Maybe that was all he needed to gather courage in the face of unending despair. As he lay in the grip of darkness, he would need to remember that every shadow is cast by a light, and sometimes, it just takes one courageous heart to reignite the glow. The glass eye continued to gleam in the stillness, waiting for the next turn of fate to unfold, but Mark's journey was far from over. In the deepest corners of his soul, a flicker of determination ignited. In the silence of his room, the fight was not finished, it was only just beginning. Mark might be surrounded by shadows, but within him still glimmered the light of hope, and he would not let it fade away without a fight. And so, the stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of his fears. The battle was not just against the echoes of darkness that wished to draw him in, but against the despair within himself. Would he be able to rise from the ashes of this moment, or would he forever remain a prisoner of his own fears? The answer awaited him, as the dawn slowly approached, bringing with it a glimmer of dawn and a chance at renewal.